Round like a circle in a spiral, like a wheel within a wheel, never ending or beginning on an ever-spinning reel, like a snowball down a mountain or a carnival balloon, like a carousel that's turning, running rings around the moon, like a clock whose hands are sweeping past the minutes of its face, and the world is like an apple whirling silently in space, like the circles that you find in the windmills of your mind. A tunnel that you follow to a tunnel of its own, down a hollow to a cavern where the sun has never shone, like a door that keeps revolving in a half-forgotten dream, or the ripples from a pebble someone tosses in a stream, like a clock whose hands are sweeping past the minutes of its face.
The formation of Southern Downs Soaring Club in Warwick brought a new era to aviation in the Warwick district. Aviation had been known in the area for more than 60 years, since an adventurous young Warwick man built himself an aeroplane and then set about learning how to fly it. He carefully tethered it to a strong fence post with a long rope while learning to taxi. He eventually got it into the air to become Warwick's first pilot. Clifton farmer Jack Bange built himself a primary glider in the 1930s, and for a while there was a gliding club operating on his property. The modern development of gliding came in the early 1960s, when Southern Downs Aero Club saw the lower cost of the sport as a way of attracting people to aviation and building up the club. The Aero Club's interest came in 1963, with members going to Oakey and later forming a committee to investigate forming a club. The moves became more concrete later that year when Jim Warner and Ted Stegel began training as instructors. Southern Downs Soaring Club was formed at a public meeting in the Warwick RSL Club on the 14th of August 1964, following an address by the then Queensland Soaring Association President, Lindsay Richards. Raising money, a big problem when starting from scratch, was ably handled by Aero Club President John Best. He called for funds at the meeting, or perhaps told people how much they could lend would be a better description, and won promises of £500 for the purchase of the club's first glider. A Kookaburra trainer was bought for £850 and an opening day held on 19th, 1964, a day which present soaring pilots would call a boomer. Thermals went to around 12,000 feet and pilots flew in from Inverell and Kingaroy. Even better was a profit on the day of £103, 5 shillings and 9 pence. The club's official opening was held on December the 13th, 1964. Club flying had started earlier using aero tow behind John Best's Tiger Moth, VH-AZR, with Gus Moak and Max Hall, trained by Jeff Raff as the tug pilots. In the meantime, the club was developing auto towing using a Ford Custom line, which proved quite successful when it was running. Here too, Harry Ray, a mechanic, and his boss Larry Cresswell were most helpful to the club. The direct auto tow was later changed to a reverse tow, which had the cable passing around a pulley and the car heading rapidly back towards the glider. Finding an instructor was not too hard. CFI Jim Warner was it for several months, and if Jim had problems on the farm, club members had to wait. They learned quickly how to be farmers as well as glider pilots. His first real relief came from Gus Moak early in 1965, when he fell victim to one of those summer viruses. Gus had hopped into a glider a few weeks before, and with his wartime flying experience was soon solo. Gus's wartime instructing experience was soon put to good use. Some say it was a case of solo on his third flight and instructing on his fourth. But in reality, there were 18 flights before he started instructing in gliders. The early response was good. The club started with 20 members, and their enthusiasm helped the committee to plan ahead. By the end of the year, a Bocian two-seater had been ordered at a cost of $4,400. Delivery was promised in a month, but as the club was to learn quickly, delivery promises could well be made by politicians. The new high-performance ship arrived about the middle of 1965. The delay in delivery and demand for the single glider led the club to buy a Skylark II in March 1965 with the help of a $2,800 loan from the Aero Club. The fourth glider, a Boomerang, was ordered in 1966 and delivered in October 1967 to start a round of goal distance flights. The club had its share of disasters over the years, with 2 gliders written off. The first was a really big disaster when fire destroyed the Kookaburra while it was being traded home after the 1968 Easter Championships at Kingaroy. Apparently, a glowing cigarette butt caught in a mattress under the fuselage. It's reported that most members cried when they heard the news. It's also reported that when they stopped crying, they realised the loss would help the club update to a second high-performance two-seater to complement the Bosien. A fund was started to buy a Blannock. Gold Coast businessman Bill Riley had established the Blannock Agency and allowed the club to use the first one in Australia for several months before the club's own Blannock arrived in 1969. The second disaster came in the latter half of 1971, when the Skylark 2 was written off in a paddock, landing just short of the aerodrome. Again, many members mourned the loss of a delightful aircraft, and once again the loss proved a forced opportunity to upgrade the fleet. An order was quickly placed on a Lebel, then the latest in glider design. The problem of first solo conversion, handled so well by the Skylark, was solved by converting the all-flying tailplane boomerang into a fixed tail and much more sedate Super Arrow. Ivan Watt led the many club members who helped in this exercise, which the club housed for many weeks. The elaborate jig on which the fuselage rested during the conversion was a design of his son, John. Major fleet changes were not seen again until the late 1970s, when the original Blannock was starting to show signs of wear and tear from the rough strip. It was sold in October 1975 to Barossa Valley Gliding Club and replaced by Whiskey Hotel, which, when it arrived at the club, had the Bravo Bravo registration of previous owner Bruce Brockhoff. Many members felt the new registration much more appropriate. Replacement of the Bosien brought a long debate on the virtues of fiberglass two-seaters, and a deposit was placed on a twin Aster in May 1977, with a view to a possible purchase in late 1978. When the time came, however, and more was known about high-performance fiberglass two-seaters, there were doubts. Inquiries to various people about the twin Aster led to the club buying its third Blannock, Victor Papa, in April 1978. The Bosien stayed with the club until it was sold in September 1978 to Murray Bridge Gliding Club. It's recently been advertised for sale in Australian gliding at $1,500 with its 20-year survey. The sale of the Bosien allowed the club to expand its single-seat fleet with the purchase of the Hornet on September the 24th, 1978. The rapid expansion of the fleet in the early days left the club with a sizable debt to be repaid to the bank, Aero Club and members. Paying the bills was not so easy either, but Treasurer Beryl Watt developed a system of paying the bill on the bottom of the pile. If anyone made too much noise about slow payment, John Best went along to have a yarn with them. His financial diplomacy worked well, for Warwick firms often carried the club's debts for months at a time, a gesture which undoubtedly helped the club through its founding years. Fundraising endeavours varied over the years, but two of the more elaborate and successful were art unions. The first offered a mini minor as a prize, but the second really captured the imagination. Club patron Mr. C.E.B. Barnes, the local member of Federal Parliament and a successful breeder, donated a free service on his champion stallion and Melbourne Cup winner Dalray. The resulting foal was the prize in an art union that was to raise $6,000. Unfortunately, a lack of records prevents us telling how successful the foal was, but the art union was a success. It even led to the club appointing an honorary veterinarian. Bob Keogh also played a big part in fundraising for the aero and gliding clubs in the early days. Bob had a penchant for organising game nights in the hangar. A lot of money changed hands and a fair percentage of it went to the club. Another fundraising venture in 1972, passenger flying at Surfers Paradise, led to major structural changes in the club and a trying time for gliding throughout Australia. The fortnight-long venture was so successful that an air charter firm complained of loss of customers and set the Department of Aviation on a long, hard look at passenger flying in gliders. The department decreed that charter licences were needed, but to get one, the club had to become an incorporated company. To achieve this, the Aero Club and Soaring Club were amalgamated in June 1975. By that time, the Aero Club had ceased to function as such and was merely providing a tug for glider towing. Legal documents would show that the Soaring Club was taken over by the Aero Club, but reality shows that the Aero Club was taken over by its infant. The enthusiasm with which members went about learning and flying was also a big help in keeping the financial wolves from the door, especially in the early days. Often were opened by 6:30 a.m. and the first flight made by 7. Now we know what Gus Moke means by an early start, but his warnings about being careful of ice on the wings in winter take on a whole new meaning. While the early birds were catching the worms in those days, catching thermals was another matter. Ivan Watt seemed to have more success than most and quickly earned the nickname of Thermaling Watt. The whole Watt family figured prominently in the club's early days. Albert, as we've seen, was one of the club's guarantors. Beryl, who was treasurer, became the club's first woman solo pilot on April 25th, 1965. And Ivan became the club's first pilot cleared for cross-country flying after an outlanding near Sandy Creek Hotel on February the 2nd, 1965. It apparently took quite a while to retrieve the Kookaburra that day, leading to a comment in the Warwick Daily News that club members would have to bear the delay because outlanding checks were necessary. Perhaps the author of the newspaper's gliding notes was on the retrieve crew. Ivan put his clearance into practice when the Skylark arrived, but unfortunately without early success. His efforts spurred on others in a race to be the first pilot with 50 kilometres in his logbook. The honour went to Reg Ralston, who flew to Mount Maria on June the 27th, 1965. Along the way, he spent a few minutes having a close look at one of Warwick's rugby league clubs playing at Pittsworth. The club's social life took a great leap in 1967 when Albert Watt bought a house at Mount Colliery, a coal mine which was closing down, and moved it to land the club was leasing from North Toolborough neighbour John Warner, now Speaker in the Queensland Parliament. Before this, club members had to adjourn to Warwick, often to a member's home for those refreshing after flying drinks. The clubhouse provided accommodation for 14, but by 1971, the demands on it led to the extension being built, and by 1972, the demand for extra accommodation made further expansion necessary. Frank Hart stepped in and donated a small cottage, which was no longer needed at the bacon factory. Ivan Watt coerced his staff of house removalists into shifting it to the club's land, which by now had been bought from John Warner. It's understood the removalists were to be paid in glider flights, a standard currency in those days, and beer, an even more standard and perhaps more acceptable currency to many. The main hangar was built in mid-1973 to ease the pressure of housing a growing fleet of private gliders. Much of the fabrication was done in Frank Hart's workshop by Ted Stegel, with the framework being transported to the club and erected with the help of Frank Hart's cranes. The long walk on a dark night to the toilets in the terminal building and the limited showering facilities led to Keith Jordan designing the toilet and shower block. Gus Moke, whose son was a plumber, became organiser and carpenter. Carl Siebert stepped into the bricky's shoes and by March 1976 had the walls soaring to great heights. Carl was at his happiest when either building things around gliding clubs or entertaining the assembly at night. One day he cast his eyes from the toilet and shower block to the clubhouse and decided it should be extended once again. He quoted $500 for the materials and didn't stop bricklaying until he'd completed the kitchen and new bar. The Aero Club's fortunes regrettably didn't match those of its baby. A reading of its minute book shows a decline which started soon after the gliding club was formed. Its Cessna 172 was not attracting many customers, and the big demand for a powered aircraft had become glider towing. John Best had provided a Tiger Moth and later a Chipmunk for aero tows. Finally and reluctantly, the Aero Club sold the Cessna and in May 1969 replaced it with an Oster, VH-SJL, or the Red Terror as it quickly became known, and established a policy of dropping general aviation aircraft in favour of one which could also serve as a glider tug. The Red Terror served the club well for many years until it was replaced by a bigger and more powerful Oster autocar. By the mid-1970s, the Aero Club was virtually functioning on an ad hoc basis, and its meetings became very irregular until the time of the amalgamation. The autocar gave the club many problems, particularly with maintenance. One tug pilot decided he wasn't too brave and wore a parachute to ferry it to Brisbane for a maintenance check. He still hasn't explained how he convinced a girlfriend to also don a parachute and fly with him. The maintenance problems and difficulty getting fuel for the autocar became too much for the club, and in the late 1970s, the search began for a Pawnee 235 replacement. Negotiations, offers and counter-offers came and went in a flurry for several months, until Swift Air at Lismore found a Pawnee taken out of crop spraying at an early age and offered it to the club. Whiskey Papa Sierra came into service in July 1977. by now very tired winch as the main method of launching. The winch was overhauled and now comes back into its own when the tug is away for service. Unfortunately, the introduction of runway lighting will probably mean the end of winching at Warwick. By the end of 1978, the club had established itself well with a fleet of 5 gliders and a tug and excellent facilities on the ground. However, it owed a lot of money, and the committee's efforts went towards reducing the debt. Operations continued healthily, allowing the club to reduce the debt and at the same time build up a sizable cash balance until, in 1983, the then small loan debt was paid out. Financially, the club has remained very healthy, so much so that it was able to buy its latest planning from Far North Coast Gliding Club in 1964 without going into debt. The years ahead seem assured for the club. The club is on very solid financial footing and is embarking on a fleet updating program. The Sparrow has already been sold, and the debate for a suitable replacement is arguing between high-performance 2-seater or a new standard class glider. Whichever way the decision goes, the new glider will help maintain the fleet at the high standard it has been in the past. The club has come a long way in the past 21 years and looks forward to the future, which seems assured, so long as there remains a challenge, the joy, the achievement of soaring with the Eagles over the Southern Downs.